The transmission came in on a band we'd stopped listening to 40 years ago, and the first word it spoke was my mother's name. I was in the galley when it happened, peeling the foil off a coffee pouch I had already let go cold twice. The Wycombe was running quiet in its long slingshot around Titan, every panel humming the low domestic hum of a ship that had been awake too long. Then the comm chimed, that small mechanical cough, and Renner's voice from the bridge said, "Mara. Mara. You need to come up here." He didn't say it the way he said it when a fuel cell drifted or a gyro got nervous. He said it the way you say someone's name when you've just opened a door and found something on the other side of it that you don't have a word for yet. I came up. The bridge was dim, only the working lights. The rings of Saturn outside the forward port looking like a record someone had laid flat across the dark. Renner was leaning over the comm board with both hands braced like a man at a railing. Behind him, Oakake was very still, which was how Oakake got when she was afraid. The speaker was rasping out a long ribbon of static, and underneath the static, a woman's voice was repeating two words. "Helen Voss. Helen Voss. Helen Voss." My mother had been dead 19 years. "It's looping," Oakake said. "It's been looping for 6 minutes." She had her hand on the volume, but she wasn't moving it. "It's coming from inside the rings." I didn't sit down. I remember that. I remember thinking that if I sat down, it would be the kind of moment that gets retold in inquiry transcripts. The captain who collapsed into a chair, and so I locked my knees and put my hand flat on the console and said, "Source? Bearing matches the wreck of the Iphigenia," Renner said. The Iphigenia had gone silent in the rings of Saturn 41 years ago, 8 crew. One of them was my mother. She had been 28 years old and pregnant with me when she signed on to that mission. Earth had sent 2 rescue ships in the first decade afterward and lost both of them. And after that, Earth had stopped sending ships and started sending eulogies. They had taught my mother's name in a unit of secondary school physics for 10 years, and then they had stopped teaching it, because the world moves on, even from the people it loses to the dark. I made them play it again. The voice was not a recording, the voice was breathing. "Helen Voss, Helen Voss, this is Helen Voss, if anyone can hear me, if anyone is still listening. Helen Voss." Renner looked at me with the careful face of a man who has been asked, without being asked, what we were going to do about it. I said, "Plot an intercept." He said, "Mara." I said, "Plot it." The Wycombe wasn't a rescue ship. The Wycombe was a survey hauler with a science deck bolted to its spine, 3 months out from Earth on a contract to map dust density in the outer rings. We had 6 crew, 2 of them civilians, a medical kit designed for sprained wrists, and 1 defibrillator that nobody had checked since Mars. We had no business going into the rings of Saturn looking for the dead. But the voice kept saying my mother's name, and I was the captain. And somewhere inside me, the small child who had grown up with her photograph on the kitchen wall stood up and said very quietly, "Go and see we burned for 16 hours. The voice never stopped. Sometimes it said other names, too, Anderson, Park, Koreshi, the rest of the Iphigenia's crew, and sometimes it said things that weren't names. It said, "The light is very kind here." It said, "You don't have to be afraid of the door," it said. "Come and be still with us." Oakake ran a voice print against the old archive recordings, the family interviews, the radio chatter from the Iphigenias last week. The voice print came back 96% confidence. It was my mother. It was my mother's mouth shaping those words. My mother's breath catching in the consonants the way it had caught on the lullaby tapes she had made for me before she left. The tapes I had played until the magnetic strip wore through, and the song came out sounding like wind. I sat in my cabin during the burn, and I held the small tin flask my mother had carried on the Iphigenia. They had returned it to my father in a sealed plastic bag along with her wedding ring and a notebook of equations, the only personal effects they had recovered from the supply drop she'd made before the ship went dark. The flask had a dent in it the shape of a thumb. I had carried it on every flight of my career. I held it now and I tried to remember her face from something other than a photograph, and I couldn't, and the comm in the corner kept saying, "Helen Voss, Helen Voss, Helen Voss," in her voice. And I understood without being told that whatever was waiting for us in the rings was not my mother, and I understood also that I was going to go anyway, because that is what a daughter does. We found the sourceums on the backside of a shepherd moon nobody had named. It wasn't the Iphigenia. The Iphigenia had been a 50-meter chemical-burned ship from the early colonial era, the kind of vessel you could pick out of a debris field by silhouette alone. This thing was 3 kilometers long. It hung in the moon's shadow like a long dark organ, ribbed and translucent in places, with rings of pale light moving up and down its length in a slow peristaltic rhythm. It looked less built than grown. There were no engines visible, no registry markings, no antennae, only that slow internal flight light, breathing. The transmission was coming from inside it. Renner said to Mara, "We do not have to go aboard." I said, "I know." He said, "We could log it. We could turn around. We could come back with a fleet," I said. "By the time a fleet got here, that thing could be anywhere." Okake said very quietly, "It could be anywhere now. It chose to be here." That was the sentence that decided me. Because she was right. Whatever it was, it had not drifted into our sky. It had positioned itself in the lee of a shepherd moon, and it had started broadcasting my dead mother's voice on a band we hadn't used in 40 years. And it had done both of those things on purpose. It was not a wreck. It was a doorway, and somebody had opened it for me. I took 3 with me. Renner because he was my second, and because he would have mutinied if I'd left him on the ship. Okake because she was the closest thing to a xenobiologist we had, and because she had hands that didn't shake. And as a civilian named Halloran, an engineer subcontracted out of one of the Belt consortiums. Because he was the only one of us who could pull a working diagnostic out of a piece of unfamiliar hardware in less than an hour. The other 2 we left aboard the Wycombe with orders to burn for home if we did not check in every 20 minutes. And I meant the order. And they knew I meant it, and that was enough. We crossed the gap in a service skiff. The thing in front of us did not react. As we approached the long pale flank of it, an opening appeared in the hull the way a pupil dilates. Smooth and wet-looking, edged in something that might have been cartilage, if cartilage glowed. The skiff drifted through into a hangar that was not a hangar. It was a cavity. The walls were ribbed and warm. There was atmosphere, breathable, faintly sweet, like the air in a greenhouse where someone has been growing tomatoes. The artificial gravity caught us gently, the way a tide catches a small boat. The voice was much louder in here. "Helen Voss, Mara, my little bird, come further in." She had called me her little bird. I had not told anyone that. It was not in any record. It was the name only she had used, in the lullaby tapes, in the last letter she had written before she left for Saturn. My little bird, fly high." I had not heard those words spoken in 19 years. Halloran said, "Captain." "Don't," I said. "I'm not going to." I said it to convince myself, and I did not entirely succeed. We walked into the corridor that opened in front of us. The floor was soft under our boots, giving very slightly, the way packed moss gives. There were lights along the walls that were not lights but luminous things. Small, slow pulses of bioluminescence, shaped like coins, like eyes, like the spiral of a fern unfurling. Things moved at the edge of vision, and we did not look directly at them. Once a long pale shape glided through a side passage without acknowledging us, 8-limbed, blind, beautiful. Okake had her scanner up, and the scanner was making a sound she'd never heard it make before. A small, confused chiming, as if it couldn't decide whether what it was seeing was alive or simply true. There were rooms branching off the corridor that I forced myself to look into as we passed. The first was full of moths the size of dinner plates, drifting in slow conical clouds, each one outlined in the same pale internal light as the walls. The second held a thing I have no word for, a column of liquid that stood upright without a container, slowly rotating, and inside the liquid swam shapes that were not fish, not anything, that turned their long blunt heads to follow us as we walked past. The third I refused to look at after the first glance. There were small, pale humanoid figures in it, the size of children, and they were not children, and they were standing in a circle, and they were holding hands. "Don't stop," Renner said very quietly. He had seen me hesitate. "I wasn't going to, you were." I kept walking. The air smelled less like tomatoes, now, and more like something I could not place at first and then could, suddenly and unpleasantly. It smelled like the back room of the funeral parlor where my father had been laid out, the cool, sweet chemical smell of a place where the dead are kept tidy. Halloran was breathing through his mouth. Okake had her scanner pressed against the wall now, the chime gone soft and rhythmic, matching the slow pulse of the corridor lights. Her face had gone the particular kind of still it went when she was working a problem she did not want to be working. "Captain," she said, "this isn't a ship. This is a body." "I know," she said. "I mean, it isn't a vessel containing an organism. It is the organism. We are inside the organism. The corridor is a vein. The lights are nerve clusters. The chambers are organs. Captain, we are walking through the inside of an animal 3 kilometers long." Halloran already said. Halloran guessed. "I am telling you. The scanner is telling you. Every reading I have ever been trained to interpret says we are inside a living thing the size of a small ocean liner. And it is aware, and it is paying attention to us. And Captain," she paused and looked up from the scanner, Captain, parts of it are humming. The walls, the floor. There is a low-frequency vibration in the structure just below human hearing. I am picking it up in the bone conduction sensors. It has a rhythm. I think it is. Captain, I think it is singing. I listened. After a moment I could feel it too, very faintly, in the soles of my boots and in the back of my teeth. It was not music exactly, it was the kind of sound a person hums to themselves while they are working on something that takes a long time. The kind of sound a gardener might make. After perhaps a kilometer, the corridor opened into a chamber. The chamber was full of people. There were maybe 400 of them. They were standing in long, quiet rows, the way wheat stands in a field. Their feet were not on the floor. Their feet were inside the floor, sunk to the ankle in the soft, pale stuff, and pale filaments rose around their calves and braided into their clothing. Their clothing was wrong for the era. Some of them wore the heavy quilted vacuum suits of the early colonial period, suits I had only ever seen in museums. Some wore the lighter shells of the Mars Line crews, the ones that had vanished in the asteroid wars. Some of them wore nothing at all. Their eyes were open, they were breathing. They were smiling in a small, mild way, as if they had just been told a joke that was not very funny but was kind. They did not see us. In the second row from the front, slightly to the left, stood my mother. She was 28 years old. She was wearing the cream-colored flight uniform of the Iphigenia. Her hair was the dark brown of the photographs, and her hands were folded at her waist, and her belly was very slightly rounded under the fabric, which meant they had taken her at the exact moment, the exact week, that the Iphigenia had gone silent, because she had been 3 months pregnant with me when she vanished. I stood my mother's flask in my pocket, and I looked at my mother, who was younger than I was now, and her chest rose and fell in the slow, patient rhythm of someone who has been asleep for a very long time and is in no hurry to wake. I had spent 19 years not being able to remember her face. I had photographs. I had the videos my father had queued up on her birthdays. But I had never been able to assemble the photographs and the videos into a moving, living woman in my head. Never been able to make her step out of the still frames and walk across a room. And over the years I had stopped trying, because the trying was worse than the not having, and now she was standing 6 meters from me, breathing, and her hair had not been combed that morning, and her left cuff was slightly turned up the way a person turns up a cuff when they have been writing at a desk, and there was a small old scar on her chin I had never seen in any photograph because no photograph had ever caught it at the right angle. She was real. She was the most real thing I had ever seen. And she was not there at all. I looked at the rest of them too, because I made myself. In the front row, I saw a man in the rough boiler suit of the belt mining ships, 50 years old, with the leathered face of a man who had spent his life in pressure suits. Behind him, a woman in the slim white uniform of the very first lunar colonies, the kind of uniform you only saw in the historical archives now. 3 rows back, a teenager, no older than 16, wearing the orange jumpsuit of the orphan training program that had run for one disastrous year in the early 40s before they shut it down. Further back, 2 people in clothes I did not recognize at all, robes of a kind, with patches sewn on them in a script I did not read, and I realized, with a small cold shock, that I was looking at people who had been taken so long ago that I did not even know which mission they had come from, that there had been ships, somewhere in the back of human history, that we had simply forgotten about, whose names were not even in the archives, and the harvester had taken them too. And they were standing here now, smiling their small, mild smiles, waiting for the gardener to come back. A voice spoke. Not her voice this time. A new voice, calm, sourceless, the voice you might hear inside your own head if your own head were a cathedral. You came, it said. We had hoped you would. Welcome, Mara Voss. Welcome to the Long Garden. I did not answer. Renner had his weapon half drawn, and I touched his wrist and he lowered it. The voice said, "Do not be afraid. None of these are harmed. They are kept. They are the seed. They have been given what your species has always asked for and never received. We have given them time, Mara. We have given them all the time there is. You took them," I said. "We harvested them," the voice said gently, as if correcting a small child. "Yes, from the wrecks, from the silent ships, from the lifeboats that drifted past us on the long, slow currents. We have been doing this for longer than your kind has had language. Every species that reaches for the dark, we find. Every species that goes silent between the stars, we tend. We are gardeners, Mara. Your mother is one of our flowers." Okeki made a small sound behind me. I did not turn. "Why are you telling me this?" I said. "Because you came when we called," the voice said. "Because you are her child, and her child should know." And because we would like very much for you to stay. I understood then. I understood with the cold, sudden clarity that comes only a few times in a life. The clarity that arrives when a long puzzle slots together inside your chest. The voice had not lured me here to give back my mother. The voice had lured me here to add me to the rose. I was the next flower. Whatever this thing was, it had been collecting human beings out of the void for thousands of years, harvesting them out of every disaster, every silent ship, every drifting capsule, and it had grown so accustomed to its harvest that it had begun calling its prisoners, seed, and its theft, gardening, and now it was bored, perhaps, or curious, and had reached out across a 40-year silence with the bait of a mother's voice to bring one more. The voice said, "She is happy here. They are all happy here. There is no pain. There is no time. You may join her. You may stand beside her, my little bird, and we will fold you gently into the long green, and you will dream alongside her until the stars themselves grow cold." That was the moment, I think. That was the moment the thing miscalculated. Because no machine, no garden, no ancient intelligence that has been harvesting consciousness out of the dark, since before our species painted on cave walls, no such thing could understand what those two words meant in that order from that mouth. My little bird, it had reached into the recordings, into the lullaby tapes, into the soft private archive of a child's grief, and it had picked up the words and put them in its mouth, and it had no idea at all, that the moment it spoke them in that tone, the spell broke. Because my mother had said, "My little bird," with the slight catch in her throat that came from laughing at her own sentimentality. The voice in the chamber said it the way a salesman says a customer's first name. It said it correctly, it said it perfectly, and it said it wrong. I felt Renner shift behind me. I felt Halloran's hand close around the strap of his equipment pack. I felt Okaki's breath go very still and very even, the way breath goes when a person has just made a decision they are not going to discuss. I said, out loud into the chamber, "What happens to a flower if you stop tending the garden?" The voice said, "We do not stop. We have never stopped. We have tended this garden since before your kind came down out of the trees." "That isn't what I asked," I said. There was a small silence. I think it was the first silence the thing had made in our entire conversation. It was not used to being asked questions it had not predicted. I took the flask out of my pocket. The flask had a dent in it the shape of a thumb. My mother's thumb. She had pressed it there during a long burnout past Mars, gripping it too hard while a fuel pressure alarm she was trying to ignore squealed in her ear. My father had told me the story so many times that I had come to remember the alarm myself, though I had not been born yet. The dent was the dent of a woman who had been frightened and had not let go. I unscrewed the cap. The flask was empty. It had been empty for 40 years. But the inside still smelled faintly of the cheap apple brandy she had used to fill it in the month she was on Earth between training rotations. I held it under my own nose and I breathed in. The smell was very small and very specific and entirely human. I said, "Halloran." Halloran said, "Yes, Captain." I said, "What do you make of the floor?" He had already been looking at it. He said in the tight-clipped voice of an engineer who has been quietly reaching the same conclusion you have been reaching. "It's organic. It's metabolizing. There's a slow current under there. Big one. It's circulating fluid through all of them. If I had to guess, Captain, I'd guess this is one organism. The walls, the lights, the floor, the rows, all of it. One big slow animal eating dreams. And if we put a hole in it?" Halloran looked at me. He had a face like a tired countryman's, lined and patient. He said, "Depends on the hole." I said, "What kind of hole could you make, right here, right now, with what's in your pack?" He thought about it for what felt like a long time, and was probably 4 seconds. Then he said, "I've got a thermal charge meant for ice. If I shape it and I put it against that pulse vein at the base of the column behind you, I think I could open this thing up like a wet bag. The chamber would lose pressure, the fluid would dump, the connections to the bodies would tear, they would die, Captain. All of them, including her." The voice in my head spoke again. It was not gentle this time. It was sharp and very large, and it filled my skull the way a flood fills a basement. "Stop, stop, Mara, you do not understand. They are not dead, they are kept. If you do this, they will be lost, she will be lost. Stop, stop, stop," I said, very quietly, to my mother who could not hear me. "I'm sorry." I said it because I knew the truth. And I had known the truth from the moment I saw her standing in the second row from the front with her belly slightly rounded and her smile mild and her eyes open and seeing nothing. My mother had died 41 years ago. The thing in the chamber had stolen her body and was using it as a lure. And what stood in the second row was not my mother any more than a pinned butterfly is a butterfly. My mother had been a woman who had laughed at her own sentimentality and gripped a flask too hard in a moment of fear and called her unborn child my little bird. My mother would not have wanted to stand in a row for 10,000 years, dreaming the same long, careful dream a machine had chosen for her. My mother would have wanted out. I said to Halloran, "Said it." The voice in my head began to scream. It screamed in many voices. It screamed in my mother's voice and in voices I had never heard, in the voices of the Marsline dead and the colonial dead, and voices in languages no human had ever spoken. It promised me eternity. It promised me reunion. It promised me my mother whole and warm, and the smell of her hair, and the song she had hummed, and the small dent of her thumb on the flask in my hand. It promised me the end of grief. I held the flask. I held the dent. I closed my hand around it until my knuckles went white. Halloran set the charge. The voice tried something else then. It went quiet. It went small and reasonable. It said, "If you do this, you also will be lost. You will not leave this place. There is no exit. There has never been an exit. The door closed when you came in," I said. "I know." Halloran looked up at me. He said, "Captain, there's a way," I said. "What?" He said, "The corridor we came through. It pulsed open for us. If I read the rhythm right, it'll pulse again at the next contraction. About 90 seconds. If we move now, we get there with maybe 20 seconds to spare. But I've got to leave the charge here on a dead man timer. If I carry it out, the connection breaks. It blows when I let go. You'd be carrying it the whole way." "Yes." "Through the corridor. Through a pulse opening that might not open." "Yes," I said. "Then run." We ran. The chamber was already shuddering, the walls flexing inward in a slow, startled spasm, the long, quiet rows of the kept beginning to sway like wheat in a sudden wind. I did not look at my mother as we passed her. I had said my apology. There was nothing else to say. The voice in my head was wailing now, full-throated, an animal sound, the sound of something very old realizing for the first time in its long life that one of its flowers had teeth. The corridor closed twice and opened 3 times. We made the second opening at a dead sprint. Halloran was behind me, with the charge cradled against his chest like a baby, his hand white on the dead man's switch. O'Cake ran with her scanner still chiming, and her free hand on my shoulder, because she had decided somewhere back in the chamber that she was not going to let her captain run alone. Renner brought up the rear with his weapon drawn, walking backward, firing at things I could not see, and that I am glad I could not see. We made the skiff. We sealed it. Halloran sat down very carefully against the bulkhead with the charge in his lap. His face was the color of old paper. He said, "Captain, I can hold it through the launch." "Can't hold it through the burn," I said. "How long can you hold it?" He said, 2 minutes, maybe 3. I said, "Renner, burn." We blew out of the cavity in the hull at a speed the skiff was not rated for. The opening tried to close on us and we clipped it. A long flap of luminous tissue tore away and trailed behind us in vacuum, like a streamer at a wedding. We made distance, Halloran counted. At 90 seconds, he said, "Captain." At 120, he said, "Captain, I can feel it slipping." At 140, I said, "Let go," and he let go, and he closed his eyes, and the charge fell out of his hand onto the deck of the skiff, and rolled half a meter, and lay there for the longest 2 seconds of my life. And then it did not detonate, because the dead man's circuit had already sent its pulse the instant his thumb came off the trigger, and the pulse had already reached the chamber a kilometer back inside the long, pale animal we had just escaped from. And the chamber was already, in that 2-second silence, opening up like a wet bag, exactly the way Halloran had said it would. The thing came apart slowly. That was the worst of it. It came apart the way a great old tree comes apart when the heart of it has rotted, in long slots of pale fluid and drifting tissue, and small bright lights going out one after another in the dark. The voice in my head stopped. It did not fade. It stopped, the way a record stops when the needle is lifted. The silence that came in afterward was the largest silence I have ever heard. We watched from the skiff. None of us spoke. Behind us, the Wickham was already moving in. Olison at the helm. Choi on the comm, calling out our names in the careful, relieved cadence of people who had not been sure they would ever call our names again. In front of us, the long, dark organ of the harvester was venting itself into vacuum. A slow, soundless blooming of pale ribbon and broken light, and somewhere inside it 400 people who had been dead for a very long time were finally allowed to be dead. I did not cry. I had thought I might. I had thought going in that if I saw her face I would not be able to hold the line. But the line held, and the work got done, and somewhere in the middle of the work I had understood the small, precise truth that no garden, no harvester, no patient ancient intelligence had ever understood about us. We do not want to be kept. We have never wanted to be kept. We have been losing the people we love since the first one of us buried the second one of us under a cairn of stones on the African veldt. And we have learned, slowly, painfully, over 100,000 years, that the love does not die when the person does, and that the love is the thing we carry, not the body. A machine that has been gardening flowers for 10,000 years cannot understand that, because a flower does not understand it either. Only the gardener understands. And we, all of us, are gardeners. Every human child who has ever lost a mother and gone on living is a gardener. We tend our dead in our heads, where they belong, where no harvester can reach. The voice had thought my mother's name was a key. It had thought, my little bird, was a password. It had not understood that the password was not the words. The password was the dent in the flask. The password was the smell of cheap apple brandy after 40 years. The password was the small private cadence of grief that I had carried in my chest since I was old enough to know what loss was, and that no thing born outside a human chest could ever replicate. Halloran said after a long time, "Captain, did we do right?" I said yes. He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because she would have wanted out." He nodded slowly. He looked very tired. He said, "Then we did right." The Wycombe took us aboard. We logged the encounter. We sent the data home in 3 separate broadcasts on 3 different bands, redundant copies, because we were already thinking about the next one. Because there would be a next one. Because if this thing had been harvesting the human dead out of the dark for 40 centuries, there were others like it. And they were still out there. And somewhere right now another silent ship was drifting past one of them. And another voice was being learned. And another lure was being prepared. We were 3 months from Earth. We had a survey contract to finish. We finished it. We mapped the dust density in the outer rings the way we had been paid to do. And we did the job well, because we are professionals. And because the work is the work, whether or not the universe has just opened a door in front of you, and you have closed it again with your own hands. We did not talk about it for a long time. There is a thing that tends to accrue after something very large, where the conversation about the thing becomes harder to have with every day that passes, because the silence around it becomes its own structure, and the structure has to be respected. The first week back on the Wycombe we worked in a kind of clean quiet, doing our shifts, eating our meals, sleeping when we could, and the only acknowledgement any of us gave was small. O'Cake left a fresh coffee pouch on my console one morning, already opened, still warm. Renner stopped saying, "Mara," and started saying, "Capt" again, which from him was a kind of formal tenderness, a way of stepping back to give me room. Halloran spent 2 days in the engine bay rebuilding a manifold that did not need rebuilding. And when he came up for dinner on the 3rd day, his hands were black with grease. And he looked, for the first time since the chamber, like a man who had landed back inside his own body. It was O'Cake who finally said it. 2 weeks out, we were both on the night watch on the bridge. The lights were low. Saturn was a long way behind us now, only a bright spot among other bright spots. And ahead of us the sun was beginning to be the largest light in the sky again. She said, "Mara, I want to ask you something. You don't have to answer." I said, "Ask." She said when the voice spoke, "When it called you my little bird, I saw your face. I have been thinking about your face for 2 weeks. I have been trying to understand what I saw. I waited," she said. "It looked like grief. But it also looked like, I don't know the word, like recognition. Like you had been waiting your whole life to hear those words again, and now you had heard them. And they were wrong, and the wrongness was the worst part. Worse than not hearing them at all. Is that close?" I thought about it for a while. I said, "Yes, that's close." She said, "I thought so." She did not ask anything else. She sat with me through the rest of the watch, and we did not speak again. And that was, I think, the closest I came on the whole flight home to crying. Because she had seen it. Because somebody had seen it and had not tried to fix it. And that was all I had needed, all along, and I had not known it was what I needed until she gave it to me. On the long burn home, I sat in my cabin at night, and I held the flask. The dent was still there. The smell was still there, very faint. I unscrewed the cap, and I breathed it in, and I said, out loud to the small empty space where my mother had lived in my head for 19 years, "I came and got you, Mom. I came and got you out." She did not answer. She has never answered. That is how I know it is her. I thought about the others too. The man in the boiler suit, the lunar woman, the boy in the orange jumpsuit, the 2 in the robes nobody remembered. I thought about how somebody, somewhere had once loved each of them and lost them. and made their peace as best they could with the silence. I thought about how those people had all died by now, the ones who had loved the lost. I thought about how the lost themselves had been kept past the death of everyone who had ever known them, kept in a long quiet room while the world they came from forgot them and went on. And I thought, that was the cruelest thing of all, not the taking, the keeping past the point where there was anyone left to come for them. Except this time there had been. This time, by a fluke of timing and a 40-year-old lullaby tape and a tin flask with a thumbprint in it, there had been someone left, and we had come, and we had opened the door, and we had let them go. I think about that a lot, on the dark watches. I think it might be the only thing we are really for, as a species, not the building of things, not the going out into the dark. Those are things any species can do, given enough time and enough metal. What we are for, maybe, is the coming back, the going and getting. The refusal to leave our people out there, even our people we have never met, even our people who died before we were born. The long, stubborn human habit of saying, that one was ours. We are coming for that one. Wait, we carry our dead. We do not surrender them. And whatever waits in the dark between the stars, patient and old and gentle-voiced, learning our lullabies and laying out its rows of pale sleepers and calling its theft a garden, let it learn this too. Let it learn that the small dent of a thumb on a tin flask is worth more than 10,000 years of eternity. Let it learn that we will come for our people. Let it learn that we will come even when we are afraid. Let it learn that we will come into the long pale animal of it with charges in our packs and our mother's names in our mouths. And we will open it up like a wet bag. And we will walk out again into the cold, clean dark. And we will keep going. Let it learn we are gardeners too.